In the previous video, we began our discussion on the conflict that arose between the Nicenes and the Semi-Arians, and that much of this conflict involved misunderstanding and false associations over lack of clarity on terminology. We discussed how, on the one hand, the Nicenes upheld a view that, while emphasizing the oneness of the Father and Son, could be perceived to be doing so by abolishing the distinction between the persons. The Nicenes described the relationship between the Father and the Son to be homoousia, that is, of one ousia. On the other side of the conflict, the Semi-Arians promoted the distinction of the persons, threatening their oneness, and consequently the divinity of Christ the Son. The Semi-Arians described the Father and Son to be of two separate hypostases. Well, it is from members of this fifth group that the Church is able to finally reach a resolution to the problem. And how this was done by them lie in the distinction made between the Greek terms ousia and hypostasis. Now again, it's important that we understand that up to this point in time, ousia and hypostasis were seen as having virtually identical meaning. And so, on the one hand, to hear the Semi-Arians state that the Father and the Son were separate hypostases was equivalent to hearing that the Father and the Son were separate ousia, that is, separate beings. And on the other hand, to hear the Nicenes say that the Father and the Son were the same ousia was virtually equivalent to hearing that the Father and the Son were one hypostasis, that is, one person. However, the new Nicenes, as they would later be called, emphasized that while these two terms were indeed synonymous in meaning, nevertheless possessed a distinction. They explained that when speaking of ousia, we speak of substance or being in the more general sense with regards to its common features, that is, those features which can be attributed to all individuals within a class of being. Hypostasis, on the other hand, refers to being or substance in the more specific sense with regards to features unique to one specific individual. Well, to give concrete examples, the difference they explained between ousia as substance and hypostasis as substance could be found in the difference between humanity as a whole, on the one hand, and a specific human being on the other. So, for example, Peter, James, and John are all equally human, ousia. That is, they all share in the ousia of humanity. But Peter is not James, and James is not John, and vice versa. And the reason for this is that Peter, James, and John are all specific human beings or hypostases of the common ousia of humanity. That is, the hypostasis is the specific realization of ousia, apart from which there would be no ousia. But imagine some extraterrestrials came to Earth and state that they want to see humanity. What would you show them? Well, the best way would be to show them specific human beings. But imagine that they asked, no, we want to see humanity in its essence. Well, the problem is, outside of specific human beings, there is no such thing. That is, you can't have humanity without specific humans. Well, likewise, you can't have ousia without hypostasis. For hypostasis is how ousia manifests itself. And in such a way, the new Nicenes explain that God was one ousia in three hypostases. This then would seem to solve the conflict. However, there are a couple of problems. The first problem relates to language barriers. Well, upon hearing this explanation from the new Nicenes, many in the Church, particularly of the old Nicenes, are going to take issue with this. Now, part of the problem here is that much of the Church in the West is Latin-speaking. And unfortunately, Latin as a language is not as rich in specified terminology as, say, Greek. Well, this characteristic difference shows itself when discussing the nature of God. Now, if you recall from the last video, the Latin equivalent for ousia is substantia. However, the Greek word hypostasis could also be translated into Latin as substantia. So when Christians in the West hear that God is three hypostases, they're translating that into Latin and hearing three substantia, that is, three beings or three gods, which is what is known as tritheism. Tri meaning three, and theism meaning God. A second problem relates to the nature of the theology itself. And the problem here is that the example given of the three persons of Peter, James, and John is, in all reality, an example of three separate human beings that can exist independently from one another. But if we were to apply that same logic equally to God's being, then we would come up with a very tritheistic theology, simply because God is not three separate independent beings. So what do we make of this? Well, the new Nicenes responded by stating that the oneness of God lie in the interrelationship that existed between the persons. That is, unlike humans, who are bound together by the common ousia of humanity alone, the persons within the Godhead are also bound together by their interdependence on one another. Well, this interdependence is shown most clearly in the very names distinguishing the persons from one another, Father and Son. And just to understand what I mean by this, imagine that one of your friends announces to you that they have become a father. Well, the natural reaction would be to congratulate that person, followed up with the question, is it a boy or a girl? But suppose that man claimed that they, in fact, had no child and that they had simply decided that very day that they were a father. Now, most of us would probably assume that either A, that person was under the influence, or B, they were mentally compromised. And the reason for this is that one cannot be a father without first begetting a child. Simply because a father is a relational term that necessitates the simultaneous existence of another person. Now, for us as humans, this is only true in a derivative sense. That is, we can exist as humans without children. But for God, it is a primary characteristic that defines his very being. For God, Father and Son are not just additional titles, but they're very names that distinguish themselves from one another. So for example, if I introduce myself as John or Peter, you are only thinking about me. But if I were to introduce myself as the Father or the Son, your obvious thought would be to ask, of whom? In other words, Father and Son are titles that cannot stand by themselves, but necessitate another person's existence. Hence, for God, the Father is primarily Father because he is the Father of the Son. And likewise, the Son is primarily Son only because he is the Son of the Father. And it is in this respect, that is, in the interrelational and interdependent respect, that God is one. Now, initially, the Church is going to look on these views with some suspicion. However, with the course of time, they are gradually going to be fully embraced and adopted by the Church as the way of explaining the nature of the Godhead. Hence, in the end, what would become orthodoxy was in essence a combination of both, on the one hand, the one ousia of modalism, emphasizing the oneness of God, and, on the other hand, the three hypostases of Arianism, emphasizing the distinction of persons. Now, it must be understood that this solution was not a compromise between the two extremes, but rather a recognition of two vitally important components contained within the character of God. What is more is that much of the conflict was not over a difference in theology, but rather over a misunderstanding of terminology. And therefore, part of the conflict was distinguishing those who differed merely in terminology from those who differed in the reality that lie behind it. However, perhaps most crucial of all was not merely the preservation of Christian union on the one hand and the preservation of the gospel on the other, but a careful balance of both simultaneously. Now, in bringing closure and resolution to one conflict, Nicaea inadvertently opened up an entirely new one. And it is this second round of conflicts that shall be the focus of our attention in subsequent videos. I invite all questions and comments in the discussion section, so please feel free to write or ask any questions below. Thanks.